The night over the Mojave was so clean you could hear the silence. A ranger on late patrol killed his engine and stared up at a river of cold stars, unaware that a vote taken 3,000 light-years away had just placed a deadline on his sunrise. In the Concorde's grand hall, a sphere of living crystal hummed and translated the will of an empire. High Admiral Zathura of the Vashti, luminous, severe, announced the verdict in a voice smooth as glass. Silent Zone 7734 has exceeded its tolerance. Prepare cleansing. The chamber's acoustics caught the word cleansing and turned it into a ritual. Across the tiered floor, the Kron delegation thumped armored forearms in assent. Order was being kept. Risk was being erased. On Earth, Dr. Elena Vasquez was alone with an ocean of data and a lukewarm mug. The new deep space array fed her a riddle, empty sectors that weighed too much, mass without matter, gravity without light. She mapped the anomalies and watched a ghostly shell take shape around the solar system. Dozens of points, equidistant, geometry so precise it felt like contempt. "You're not rocks," she murmured. "You're watchers." In a hollowed asteroid riding a Trojan orbit, a ship waited like a secret. Project Aegis had taken the worst idea in science. Bolt the alien thing to the human thing and see if it hums, and made it policy. A lunar mine had dug up a shard of something not built by hands. Dr. Marcus Webb had stripped the shard for math and found a drive equation that didn't care where zero ended. They named the testbed Thunderchild because the engineers were fatalists and the pilots had a sense of humor. Captain Sarah Chen ran the checklist with the calm of someone who understood that fear was just energy looking for work. Drive coil stable, hull temps nominal. If I don't come back, water my plants. On the command pit's ring, Admiral Rebecca Stone lifted an eyebrow. "Bring me the plants and the ship, Captain." With a breath and a blessing, Thunderchild punched a hole in the local definition of distance and fell through. She came out beyond the Kuiper like a fish leaping into a different lake. The stars were the same, but the dark was crowded. The shell that haunted Elena's numbers gleamed here, sentinel spires the size of small moons, skin like frozen lightning, throwing thin lines of signal at one another. Chen killed emission and listened. Her console whispered in a language no human throat could form. The alien code broke itself on repurposed circuits and offered translation as if embarrassed. Quarantine perimeter nominal. Primitive species follows projected curve. No FTL signatures detected. Primitive. Chen smiled without humor and marked every transmission path she could catch. When she turned Thunderchild home, a sentence had already rewritten the world. "We are not alone and we are not free." They convened in a room where no nation's flag looked bigger than any other. The crisis drew old enemies shoulder to shoulder, noses inches from the edge of history. Chen wore her flight suit still. Elena carried a projection of the shell like a crown of thorns. Webb showed equations that smelled like ozone. Admiral Stone did what good admirals do. She named the truth out loud so everyone could bleed together. "We have 2 weeks, maybe less, before a fleet arrives to erase us. We don't have better friends, we do have better options." Her brief was simple, indecent, American in the old sense, hit the seam in their story. Concorde doctrine assumed energy supremacy, shields that drank beams, beams that boiled worlds. "So we don't give them beams," said LT, Call. James Wright, a demolitionist with the smile of a man who'd married entropy. "We give them tungsten at a significant fraction of regret. We plate ships like it's 1943 and build guns the size of city blocks. We go kinetic. Alina raised a hand. And when the beams do come, we don't block them, we bend them. Her prototype was ugly and brilliant, a gravitational shear lens built from captured principles and insane amounts of power. Curve space a hair's breadth here, a hair's breadth there, and the straightest weapon in the galaxy forgets where straight is. The math could kill them, so could not trying. 2 weeks, Stone said again, not as despair but as drumbeat. We turn miners into machinists, stadiums into factories, satellites into teeth. We make every orbit a problem. She didn't promise victory. She promised a fight the galaxy would never forget. Outside, the Mojave held its breath. The ranger kicked his bike to life and rode through a night that wasn't quiet anymore. Somewhere beyond Pluto, alien sentinels adjusted their posture like wolves catching a new scent. And far away on a ship paved in black armor, Admiral Thax of the Kron watched human intercepts and saw, to his surprise, his reflection. "They are too fast between mistakes," he told Commander Krell, who'd worn the Concorde's rank long enough to forget the weight of his own. "They learn like fire." Krell grunted at the tactical purity of the plan to come. 2 weeks was mercy, he thought. It would be enough for the primitives to pray. The galaxy expected our silence. America, the idea, not the borders, had other plans. We don't go quiet. We tune the thunder. Factories remembered how to sing. Rust Belt towns lit their furnaces like old prayers and poured steel into shapes that would make their grandparents cry. Shipyards woke from civilian sleep and bolted together hulls that looked like contradictions. Angled slabs of armor around alien hearts, high G rails laid down the spine, bays for drones cheap enough to die by the thousands. The designs were wrong by Concorde standards. That was the point. Alina's team turned Ceres into a metronome. The sheer lenses weren't shields so much as politely curved arguments with physics, anchored to rock and math and the stubbornness of a species that built cathedrals to the invisible. If we're off by a decimal, her deputy warned, we juicer our own fleet. Alina rubbed at the bridge of her nose and nodded. Then don't be off. Thunderchild ran courier in the dark, her drive a new swear word. Chen learned the perimeter's rhythm. Sentinels rotated watch in patterns that made auditors happy and enemies happier. She tagged blind cones, logged the time it took an automated mind to notice a weirdness, baited one node with a trash probe that squealed like an FTL engine, then counted to learn the Concorde's attention span. War turned out to be customer service with worse hold music. In the Grand Hall, Zathura wore victory like a uniform. The vote to cleanse had been clean. A millennium of precedent makes murder tidy. She summoned the fleet with a line of light across the crystal sphere. Commander Krell received doctrine packages that smelled like old triumphs. Emerge at long range, sift for launch capacity, remove orbitals, sterilize biosphere. A ceremony in 6 acts. He'd conducted it 17 times. He was very good at it. Admiral Thax read the same doctrine and felt his forearms tighten with an instinct he'd buried under medals. His people had once been the storm at someone else's gates. Then they'd traded the wild for the leash, and honor had become a dress uniform word. He stared at human footage, fighters hugging asteroids like street racers taking corners on rims, missiles with no signatures but speed, voices over open comms that laughed while doing math, and his throat did a small traitorous thing. They fight like we used to. On Earth, the meeting table turned into a forge. Admiral Stone ran the room like a conductor. "We don't beat 5,000 ships. We beat the way they fight. They are a cathedral of choreography." Cut the organist. Captain Chen tossed up a schematic of the Dominion-class flagship, its communication arrays a crown of brittle pride. "You hit that, the orchestra forgets the music." Wright's boys took over an old car plant and started printing rods by the thousand, tungsten and depleted uranium, and anything that didn't mind being accelerated until the universe took it personally. He loved his work the way chefs love knives. "It's not elegant," someone complained. Wright grinned. "Elegance is for eulogies. The first test was a sin and a revelation. A Vashti courier slipped into the system to check the watcher's posture. Stone let it walk into an empty alley and then shut both ends with jammers. The courier poured beam into the space where a human frigate had been. The beam bent around a lump of math and came out the other side confused. 2 rods later, the courier wore a new skylight. A third cracked its spine. It took 6 seconds to die badly. "We just declared," Stone said, voice low, not triumphal. Every sentinel in the shell woke and focused on the blue world that had decided it wasn't afraid. Concord comms lit with a teeth-edge hum. Far away, Zathura's poise flickered. "Krell," she said, losing a syllable to something like surprise, "arrive with ceremony if you must, but finish it quickly." That night, a message slipped across a crowded sky and landed in a human inbox that didn't exist before that hour. "I am Admiral Thax of the Kron. I speak on a channel our masters won't hear. Your species is about to be erased in the name of order. I believe order without honor is just fear in uniform." He attached patterns, formation habits, target priorities, the ways 1,000 ships pretend to be one mind. He did not ask for trust. He asked for company in the sin of saying no. Stone read it twice, then looked at Elena Webb Chen. "We could be taking a knife from a stranger and pointing it at our own ribs," she said. Chen shrugged. "We could be taking a friend's hand when the bar fight starts." Elena added, "We lose nothing by listening. We lose everything by refusing to learn." Stone sent a reply that was not a promise and not a refusal. It was a sentence that made a shape in Thax's chest he'd thought fossilized. "If you step toward us, we won't step back." Around the world, printers screamed. In space, miners who'd never worn a flag welded turrets to rocks named after dead dogs and forgotten cities. Children learned the old drill of blackout curtains not as fear but as rhythm. "This is how you love your street." The Concorde expected panic, then pleading, then surrender. What arrived instead was logistics. 2 weeks narrowed. The first thundercloud rolled. The Kron Vanguard arrived like a tide diagram, perfect arcs, measured separations, a geometry that could be framed and hung in a museum of obedience. Their scouts bled data back to doctrine. Their doctrine clicked and hummed and said as usual. Commander Krell stood on the warspine and felt the comfort of the familiar press against a small, hard doubt. "Signal the ritual," he ordered. "Announce lawful action, offer formal mercy." The words tasted like dust. The ritual broadcast slid across the solar system in 42 approved languages. "Surrender your skies. Power down your engines. Submit your species to assessment and relocation. Failure to comply will result in sterilization measured, merciful, complete." The message had ended 100 civilizations and been called a kindness. On Earth, it played on mute while people finished what they were doing. Admiral Stone answered with a transmission that was wrong in every way, No preface, no posture, just a human standing in a uniform that had been stitched 3 weeks ago from a flag that had been waiting centuries. We're not a variable, we're your reminder. You can choose to be better or we can choose to be busy. She killed the link and turned to the room. They'll think it's bravado. Good. Let them. Elena's network came live. Space flexed in ways that made astronomers stroke out. Sheer nodes around Mars teased energy into curves. Micro lenses nested like matryoshka in orbits no insurance company would write. The math wanted to run away like a colt. Elena held the reins and whispered the old lullabies of calculus. Easy, easy. Bend, don't break. Captain Chen took defiance into the clutter and smiled because Rock taught a different school than parade grounds. Wing, keep your front toward their pride. If you feel the hair on your neck rise, that's a lens waking up. Don't be there. Her squadron slid between asteroids the size of cities, hulls scoring bright where stone kissed steel. When the first Kron beams came, they came like scripture, straight, flawless, assured. The beams hit the lens net and discovered humility. The Kron's shields drank energy, energy that refused to arrive made them thirsty. Wright's rods did not ask permission. They crossed the field quiet as sin and talked to armor like a blunt friend. A destroyer learned about internal organs. A cruiser learned about momentum. The comms on Warspine filled with the sound of professionals whose training had not covered this exact insult. Krell's doubt grew teeth. On the edge of the fight, Admiral Thax kept his formation on paper and his heart on a wire. A private channel bloomed with Stone's voice and the map he'd sent her, annotated now with human graffiti, arrows that made bad sense and good trouble. Trust is a verb, she'd said. He looked at his helmsman. Helm, test fire, miss by a meter. The shot went wide by exactly a meter and cut a Vashti drone that had been slinking toward his flank. His officers stared. He let them. Then he said, very softly, some orders are a request to forget who you are. On Ceres, a capacitor screamed. Elena's console wavered through 7 colors a human eye doesn't normally get. She tapped a sequence like prayer and drank recycled air that tasted like tin. Network stable. Margin for error is now what poets call thin. The courier kill had been a statement. This skirmish was a syllable in a new language. Human tactics read the field like a pickup game. See the big kid throw low, see the speedster cut the lane. If the defense wants straight lines, give them circles. Kron formations broke into subgroups because being perfect together had stopped working. Where doctrine thinned, skill mattered. On those edges, Chen ate. Punch the whisper boat, she ordered, and 4 rails coughed in sequence. An Omiri coordination craft, with sensors like gods and armor like soda cans, tried to be somewhere else and failed. Local Kron ships lost the hum in their ear that turned instruction into instinct. For 3 seconds they were just crews in boxes in a dark ocean. 3 seconds is a lifetime when tungsten is in the air. Krell shifted posture with a speed that would have humiliated a lesser officer. Adaptive wedge, close to knife range, cancel the dance. The wedge chewed up rocks and spat downrange. The Kron at their worst were still beautiful. Chen lost a frigate that had been a town's worth of dinners and hands. The crew went quiet and then a lot of people got very loud. Stone made the sound into discipline. We count the names later. For now, feed them the fight they didn't pack for. At the edge of radar, Thax made his choice. He turned his prow off the authorized line. By a fraction that doctrine would call treason and honor would call home. To all Kron within reach of my voice, he said on a channel he was not supposed to know existed. Remember, we were warriors before we were signatures on a treaty. If you will not fire on a species that has not struck your home, turn with me." 3 ships answered, then 12. Then the number stopped meaning anything and became a direction. When the shooting eased, not because anyone ran out of anger, but because everyone ran out of clear targets, the field was a graveyard that would teach future navies new maps. The Concorde had not been bloodied like this in generations. Elena took her glasses off and pressed fingers into the hurt above her eyes. Wright leaned against a bulkhead and wiped someone else's soot off his cheek. Chen floated in a cabin that smelled like hot metal and lime and stared at the name they'd add to a wall later. Admiral Stone stood over the plot and saw not a victory but a word: possible. You don't get to choose miracles. You choose the work that lets miracles happen without apology. The galaxy had heard the first subwoofer hum under the floorboards. The chorus was coming. Concorde procedure said you never talk to prey after the opening exchange. It gave them ideas. Admiral Stone broke procedure with the same calm she used to pour coffee. She requested a direct line to Commander Krell and got it because curiosity is a larger force than protocol. He appeared on her screen like a cliff that had learned to read. His eyes were hard, which is different from cruel. "You killed my ships," he said, not angry, accounting. "You brought a ritual to a street fight," Stone returned. "We don't do rituals here." Behind her, the command deck wore purpose like armor. People move the way Americans move when they've agreed this is their problem and no one else is coming. Flags were present but behaved themselves. The only banner that mattered was the plot board with too many red lights and not enough blue. Stone didn't sell fear. She sold choice. You can carry out a script written by people who forgot how to bleed, or you can fight for something that won't leave a bad taste in your grandchildren's stories. She slid a packet across the quantum line, a montage of cities and farms, uniforms and ball caps, funerals and block parties, the human argument for why existence is maintenance and joy, not compliance. She did not show weapons. He had those angles already. Krell's jaw worked once. "You think you are the first to bargain?" "No, just the first to bargain with leverage." She tipped her chin toward a secondary feed, Admiral Thax no longer careful, turning with a chunk of the Kron order of battle like a school of armored fish, realizing the river belongs to no one. Krell's pupils contracted. The sound he made was pride losing a fight with grief. "You put doubt in my house," he said. "We didn't put it there," Stone replied. "We just knocked." While they spoke, Elena's team pushed the lens net out like a fisherman who'd counted the tide. The equations fought back and so did space. Power feeds whined. Thermal margins turned into whispered arithmetic. "We can hold this shape for 21 minutes before it goes from clever to criminally negligent," Elena reported. "Then we have to breathe or we'll black out half the system." 21 minutes is a war, Stone said. "Make them busy." Wright rolled a cart into a bay already stacked with things that would make diplomats frown. "Big rods are music, but it's time for hail." He'd printed micro-slugs by the million, dense, dumb, fast, meant to sandblast fighter screens and chew the edges off capital ship arrays. "We don't have to kill their teeth," he told Chen on a shared channel. "We just have to chip them until chewing hurts." Chen felt the deck hum under her boots as loaders fed rails. "Copy. Let's make dentistry a team sport." Defiance broke from cover with a pack that moved like a bar fight on skates. They didn't charge the Kron wall. They skated past, flaying at sensors, slicing antennae, erasing the tiny flyers whose only job was to keep the big killers in tempo. Every orchestra needs its metronomes. The humans threw them down the stairs. In the Kron formation, chaos wasn't loud. It was silence where there should have been harmony. Krell's aides added their voices until the air was thick with relay, but you can't shout a symphony back into being. He looked at Thax's vector, a knife aimed not at anyone's belly but at the Dominion-class crown where command lived. To turn against it would be to admit a lifetime wrong. To let it fall would be to admit the same thing later with worse handwriting. On a protected frequency, Thax spoke without preface. "You taught me drills. Before that, my grandmother taught me songs. Only one of those was about why we fight." He sent Krell a packet like stones but older, Kron children tumbling under low gravity, elders pounding forearms not in salute but in rhythm, a field where young warriors learn to lose well before they learn to win. We didn't join to become someone else's thunder. We joined to stop needing thunder at all. Krell closed his eyes long enough to hear both centuries, then opened them on the only century he could touch. "All ships," he ordered, voice steady and not quite the same, "hold fire. I will consider terms." Gasps bloomed and were extinguished. He turned back to Stone. "If I talk, I will be called traitor." "If you don't," Stone said, "you'll be a loyal man at the worst funeral." He said nothing for 3 breaths that lasted 20 years. Then, "Send your proposal." She'd already sent it. Not surrender, but realignment, Kron's sovereignty, no more cleansing. A defense pact that reads like a handshake. Amnesty for officers who chose conscience. A tribunal for those who made murder into habit and called it peace. It was ambitious. It was America and also human. Start the argument, make it better later. Zathura watched her board go from choreography to jazz and snarled in a dialect nobody had heard since the Vashti lived in caves of light. She burned a hole through doctrine and threw a planet breaker toward the blue marble that had gotten uppity. It arrived in system with all the confidence of a god and none of the homework. Elena felt the charge like a pressure headache from the sun. "New contact. Flagship grade, charging a world cracker," she said, and all the polite words left the room. "I can bend it maybe, but if we slip, we carve our own ocean sideways." Admiral Stone didn't blink. "Then we don't slip." She turned to Chen. "Take a bite out of their jaw while Elena holds their tongue." Chen smiled a wolf's small smile. "Copy, ma'am, open wide." The Americans watching at home, steelworkers on their second shift, a kid in a Nebraska garage rewiring a drone he'd named after a dog, a nurse in Philadelphia text-stacking prayers between rounds, didn't hear the orders. They felt the pause in the planet's breath when a weapon from a patient empire came up to speed. The night over the Mojave wasn't quiet anymore. It was the intake before a shout. Chen's wing rolled in the sunlight. Elena's math reached for the beam. The planet breaker exhaled, and the story of silence reached the part where thunder begins. The planet breaker woke like a sunrise turned sideways, a line of white that made instruments flinch and human bones want to hide. Elena rode the numbers until her fingernails hurt. Lock shear on vector delta 3. Feather don't grab. On Ceres, the lens lattice pulled its space with the finesse of a violinist and the appetite of a black hole. The beam arrived as scripture, straight, flawless, certain, and met a geometry that refused to believe in straight lines. Space sagged. Light obeyed. The planet killer curled, not much, just enough to miss blue and kiss a pocket of dark where a Vashti escort had decided to feel important. Energy meant for a world scraped a cruiser's shield and turned its skin into flowing glass. The rest of the shot skated past, split by nested shears into ribbons that faded into the far cold. Alarms across continents dropped from screams to arguments. Elena exhaled and tasted copper. Again and I break the net, she warned. We got lucky and good at the same time. Copy, Stone said. Let's manufacture more of both. Thunder up, Chen called, and defiance led her pack across an angle no flight instructor would have signed. Wright's hail vomited into space, micro-slugs like a sandstorm fueled by spite, chewing fighters, fogging radars, shaving comm booms to glitter. 4 rails on Defiance coughed in a rhythm that felt like boots on bleachers. A tungsten spear found the wounded escort's reactor. The ship folded inward with obscene grace and wrote a new constellation of wreckage. On the Kron command deck, Krell felt the beams miss like an insult to physics. Impossible, someone said, which is what people say when they haven't met Americans yet. Krell watched human ships carve the air the way street kids carve alleys, rule by proximity and nerve. Thax's detachment slid along the formation's hip, not firing on humans, not yet firing on family. His silence on the command net felt louder than any gun. Zathura refused to feel anything but command. Charge again, she told the Planet Breaker captain, voice flat as an invoice. Increase feed. Overwhelm their trick. She called it a trick because calling it a tool would mean admitting parity. Elena's team watched the second charge build and did math with trembling hands. We can't bend that twice, her deputy murmured. We can if we change the ask, Elena said. Don't deflect, diffuse. She retuned the lattice to a smear of micro-lenses, not one wall but 1,000 soft suggestions. When the second beam came, it didn't curl, it shredded. Harmless only in the way gravel is harmless to an ocean. Harmless enough. Krell's aide, young by Kron standards, old enough to have names for honor, swallowed. If they can do that to our pride weapon, they can do it to us, Krell finished. He opened a private line. Thax. I'm here, Thax said. No rank added. No, sir. Friends don't waste time on ceremony while the roof is on fire. Your channel to the humans, how clean. Cleaner than our conscience. Then hear this, Krell said, tasting blood in a part of his heart he'd starved for decades. I will not fire on a people who put their bodies between a planet and a beam. I will not be another empire's thunder. I will stand with those who bent light with courage. Thax's reply was a grin you could hear, and let's make new doctrine. The Kron split was not theatrical, it was steady. Ships peeled away from the choreography like stones from a landslide, numbers at first small, then stubborn, then a mass that changed the map. On the Loyalist net, Captain Mordak roared words that had carried civilizations into graves. Duty, order, purity. On the Defector net, Thax offered a different inventory. Memory, promise, choice. Humanity listened with one ear and kept loading rails. Defiance took hurt. A bolt that cheated around a half-spun lens ligature tore armor and turned a corridor into a sculpture of smoke and silence. Chen saw 3 names go red on her board and did what good captains do. She said them to herself and put them with the others. In that back pocket the living carry so the dead don't have to walk alone. Keep moving, she told her helmsman. We're only alive while we're inconvenient. The Planet Breaker captain tried a third shot because habit is a god and because Zathura's eyes had never learned to say enough. Elena didn't have a third deflection. She had something worse and better, a feed line into the sun. We can bleed their beam into a solar sip, she said, the phrase insane and correct. We'll tickle the photosphere and pray we don't burp flare. Stone ran a half-second calculus that had nothing to do with math. Do it, she said, because that is the job. The third shot came, and the net drank a portion of it into the star like a thief skimming bills from a roll. The sun hiccuped, frowned, then forgave them. The rest of the beam frayed and died. On 100 back porches, people who didn't know the word gravimetry looked up and saw a shimmer like heat above the day. They would tell their kids years from now that the sky had flexed to keep the street. Zathara's jawline whitened. Enough toys, she hissed. All ships, advance, break them with mass. The board answered with motion. The Grand Fleet rolled. Admiral Stone adjusted her headset, a gesture small as a trigger. We hold them at the throat of their pride, she said. Thax with me on the right. Krell, if you mean it, now is when it stops being poetry. Krell's reply was a roar his people had not heard in a generation. Kron, with me, today our name is not a signature, it is a sound. The thunder finally arrived, and it did not belong to one banner. Mass has its own courage. The Concorde brought 5,000 ships into a corridor of bent sky and still believed in walking. Stone knew courage wasn't the problem. Belief was. Belief in old plays, belief that the universe was obliged to behave. She aimed to make disbelief hurt in the right direction. Gravnet to tide channels, Elena said, sweat stinging her eyes. The lattice shifted from wall to river, subtle slopes that nudged enemy formations into lanes they didn't intend to occupy. Fighters found themselves stacked wing to wing. Cruisers discovered their escorts weren't where escorts belong. A Kron wedge loyal to Mordak slammed into a Vashii column that thought it had right of way. For 60 seconds Order ate itself. Cut their metronomes, Stone ordered. Chen obliged. Defiance and 3 wolfish destroyers sifted for Omiri conductors, thin-hulled ships that turned the mass into choir. Every time one died, a patch of the Concorde went tone-deaf. Wright's hail did its ugly work. Slugs ate antenna farms and chewed sensor rings down to bald metal. We're not killing them, Wright muttered, half apology, half pride. We're making them guess. Guessing is where humans live. On the Kron channel, Mordak dragged his fleet back into shape by rage alone. Traitors, he spat at Thax and Krell. You trade duty for sentiment. Thax came back warm as a fist on a shoulder. No, we trade obedience for honor. Honor is compliance. Honor is what makes compliance optional. They met at spear range, because old friends deserve closeness. Mordak's Warbiner vomited beam. Thax's gale swam the lens's softened edge and fed tungsten across a vector the beam could not own. Warbiner's flank armor tore like wet bark. Yield, Thax said on an open channel, which is love in a language professional soldiers respect. Mordak replied with a burn that kissed Gale's bow and turned 6 crewmen into names. I decline. Krell entered the brawl like a verdict. Warspine crossed in a line that made math clap, and a Kron-on-Kron rail duel wrote a chapter nobody in doctrine had bothered to author. The Loyalists broke, not from fear, not all at once, but the way a bone breaks when a runner decides to turn on a bad step. Some fled, some killed, some turned and saw who they were and chose. Stone didn't watch the duel, she watched its effect. Holes opened in the grand alignment like ripped seams. Through them, she saw the dominion of stars riding the center like a cathedral on tracks. That's our organist, she told the room. Task Force Arrow form on defiance. Thax, Krell screen the lanes. We're going for her crown. Copy, Chen said, already angling her flight for the deadliest alley in human history. Her hands were steady because they'd been taught 1,000 small disciplines by 100 cheap jobs. She had fueled planes at midnight and balanced budgets with coupons and learned the trick everybody learns in a hard year. You move anyway. Alina's voice came across thin. I can hold tide channels for 12 minutes. After that, we're juggling knives in a bounce house. 12 is luxury, Stone said. We'll be out in 8. Wright appeared at Alina's elbow with a grin that had body shop grease in it. If the knives fall, I have a terrible, beautiful idea, he said, producing a crate stamped with warnings in 7 alphabets. Micro-shear grenades. We toss them like confetti under big girls' skirts and pray to the god of engineering that they only ruin their day. You tested them. In the sense that I threw one at a rock and ran. Right. Alina pressed her palm to the crate. You're not throwing these from here. Didn't plan to. He slapped a mag strap across his chest. Figured I'd hitch a ride with Chen. Alina wanted to say no. She wanted to say we need you later. She had also watched him hand victory to strangers by sanding 1,000 hard edges off impossible problems. Don't be a martyr, she said. Ma'am, he replied, I'm from Pittsburgh. We invent unions, not martyrdom. Defiance hit the screen around Dominion and felt the difference between a fleet and a fortress. The flagship wore armor like intention. Its escorts layered beam in a lattice that would turn most runs into heat and debris. Chen flew not through the lattice but with it, using the microslips in Alina's tied to surf ridges beams didn't occupy for the length of a heartbeat. 2 escorts died in ways they had not been trained to imagine. One lived and broke a hole in Defiance's left flank that would have been terminal if not for Keystone, a human frigate that leaned its damaged side into the wound and turned the hit into a ragged miracle. Keystone's captain came on the net long enough to say, "Tell my sister the dog can have the couch." And then the ship came apart polite as a bow. Wright's shuttle rode Defiance's wake and then didn't, because you don't ask a destroyer to spoon-feed you to a giant. He and a squad of maniacs in borrowed armor bumped their way across the debris field toward the flagship's belly, the shuttle's skin ticking with impacts that sounded like summer rain on a tin roof. Close enough, he said, and kicked the ramp into a vacuum that hated him. Micro-shears bloom quietly. The grenades did not explode. They insisted. Local space forgot how to be aligned for a quarter second at a time. Dominion's ventral arrays stumbled. Her point defense kissed air that wasn't where it had been promised. Open, Wright breathed, and Defiance put a rod through the newly discovered gap. Dominion did not bleed, not yet, but she flinched. That was enough for now. 5 minutes on the tide, Alina warned. A gauge somewhere tried to crawl off the panel and go live on a farm. Arrow last push, Stone said. We don't need a kill, we need a silence. Chen nodded to nobody. Then let's take their voice. The Dominion of Stars sang to its flock in a dozen bands of light and graviton whisper. Stone's plan wasn't to break the ship. It was to make her forget the song. EMP lances ready, Chen said. Defiance's auxiliary bays coughed canisters that weren't elegant and weren't supposed to be. They burst in electromagnetic petals across the flagship's crown. Arrays that had whispered tempo to thousands of hulls all day suddenly found themselves deaf. Across the Grand Fleet, formation queues went null. Captains who had spent centuries outsourcing judgment to a symphony reached for instinct and grabbed air. Some fought better. Many fought worse. A few simply stopped, which is what happens when the instructions run out and nothing had taught you how to be a person. Boarding windows opening, Thax reported. He had abandoned any pretense of neutrality. Kron breacher craft, purpose-built to argue with bulkheads, darted under Dominion's shields like sharks who knew the reef's map. Krell placed Warspine broadside to the flagship's forward arcs, daring it to choose between his armor and its pride. If she turns for me, he told Stone, your corridor widens. If she doesn't, Stone said, your grandchildren get good stories. They deserve them either way. The first breach tore a ring corridor where Vashti air smelled of ozone and almond, elegant and wrong. Kron Marines moved like they remembered houses and hallways with lower ceilings. Behind them came a squad wearing misfit plates and American flag patches, strapped into suits borrowed in the alley behind a scrap yard. Wright and friends, carrying a bag that made Alina twitch even from far away. We're headed for Crown 2, the secondary C3 suite. Wright huffed. If we can't keep the whole band from playing, we can at least steal the drummer. On the bridge, Zathura held herself like a blade left in water too long, still deadly, starting to pit. Isolate internal control, she snapped. Purge compromised partitions. Vent boarded sections. An officer hesitated because the map lit red across modules that hosted hundreds of her own. I gave an order, she said, but the vowels were tired. Hi, Admiral, came a voice from a ceiling speaker that refused to know its place. Stone had routed a whisper into Dominion's local net with the help of a bored South African hacker who thought this was more fun than finals. You still can end this without having to write a letter to a million mothers. You presume I care for letters. No, Stone said, soft. I presume you care for winning. There's no win left in this shape. Zathura's reply was a slash of lockdown commands and a firing solution for anything not wearing her colors. The ship shuddered. Something large outside went away loudly. Inside, gravity hiccuped down a stairwell and 13 Marines learned the old Kron lullaby for falling. Crown 2, Wright panted, skidding behind a bulkhead as a defense node spiked the corridor with heat that made paint smell like almonds too. Pop the door. A breacher slapped a microshear onto the frame. The world lost alignment in a coin-thick slice. The hatch pretended to be a suggestion and then obeyed. Inside, a geometry of consoles, an altar to control. He lobbed a second shear into the console's heart and was halfway through a joke about voiding warranties when shrapnel from a secondary sent him into a slow-motion cartwheel through a web of dead light. He hit hard, didn't get up. Right. Chen barked across a mesh she shouldn't have been watching. He coughed once, found the mic. Good news, boss, he rasped. We just made their drummer stutter. Bad news, I think I left part of myself in Crown 2. If you see it, send it home. Shut up and crawl, Chen said, but her voice had salt in it. Dominion's bridge flickered as subsystems went blind. Zathura's fingers danced competent, furious music over dead keys. Restore. I said restore. There is a note even tyrants can't hit. The one where you ask a broken thing to make you whole, and it refuses because it cannot. She lifted her chin and looked into a future where the word cleansing had teeth only in history books. It was too heavy for one neck. She dropped her eyes first. Hi, Admiral, Stone said, mic now honest. I will take your surrender. I will put you in a box that obeys rules. I will try very hard to make sure the law that judges you has mercy in it because I want to live in a world where mercy is normal. She paused. Or we can keep writing names. On the flank, Krell bled from a cut he hadn't noticed. Warspine's vents coughed flame like a dragon with bad lungs. Choose, he whispered to no one and everyone. Zathura chose fatigue. She keyed a code she'd sworn she'd never use and let the ship tell the fleet the thing fleets are not trained to hear: stand down. For a moment nothing moved. Then pockets of fight guttered. Beams starved. Rails fell quiet. In the sudden undersound, you could hear 1,000 people remembering how loud their own breath is. Thax sagged against a bulkhead that had been a wall and would now be a story. Chen closed her eyes for the length of one name, and then opened them because names deserve futures, not statues. Wright lay on the floor of Crown 2 and watched a hairline crack skitter across a dead display like an insect. "Hey," he murmured to the room, to the ship, to Pittsburgh, to anybody. "We did it stupid and right." Nobody contradicted him. History doesn't end. It changes key. The Grand Fleet broke into ships with faces. Surrenders came in 100 dialects of exhaustion. Some loyalists ran and were chased. Some cut power and floated like stones remembering rivers. Krell coordinated the ceasefire in tones that made new officers out of old enemies. Thax had to sit down once and laugh because it didn't hurt yet, and he remembered too. On Dominion's bridge, Zathura stood between two Marines and looked smaller in cuffs than a myth should. Stone didn't stage the moment. She took no victory shot. She asked for a med kit for a crewman with a burned hand and gave the High Admiral a bottle of water because being American sometimes means you hand the villain a drink so you can look at yourself later and not flinch. "The tribunal won't be easy," she said. "I do not ask for easy." "Good," Stone replied. "We'll try for fair." Ceres exhaled. Elena slumped in a chair she'd stolen from a cafeteria and stared at a board with no red on it for the first time in hours. The sun had survived being asked to help. She put her forehead on the console and thanked a star like it was a neighbor who'd lent sugar. When she lifted her head, her deputy was holding out a crumpled printout of a waveform. "We tapped the photosphere," he said, eyes bright in a way that embarrassed them both. "We learned something. Beautiful." She smiled like a tired person who just realized tomorrow has breakfast in it. "Then let's live long enough to publish." Chen took Defiance past the Mojave at dawn because she could, because sometimes you fly over home to remind yourself which way gravity points. Down below, a ranger parked his bike and waved at a streak that was not a shooting star. She waved back without thinking and imagined he saw it, because today imagination was allowed. Wright woke up 3 days later to a ceiling he didn't hate and a doctor who wouldn't let him sit up without making a speech about spines. "You owe me a tour of Pittsburgh," she said, not looking up from his chart. "You bring sandwiches. We'll hit the incline and argue about the best pierogi," he said, voice raw with gratitude and morphine. On the tray beside him lay a medal shaped like a bolt, awkward and perfect. He pretended not to see it. He had work left. Across the old Concorde, messages unspooled that had not been written in 3,000 years. Station chiefs woke to find their supply chains had turned into questions. Governors received resignations from garrisons that did not want to police farmers anymore. On a ship in a dark nebula, a Kurath elder cried like a child and then began organizing a convoy to bring medicine to a world that had never had a name in Concorde records at all. The first Accords convened on Ceres because the rock had already been sacred for one kind of math. It might as well host the other. Flags that had learned to share a sky learned to share a table. Krell came without guards and left with a title that wasn't a shackle: Warden of the Free Lanes. Thax refused any office and accepted a job that had no letterhead: teach former enemies how to spar without making funerals. Elena took a seat no one had invented before, custodian of the lattice, and wrote laws about when not to touch the sun. Stone read the first clause into the mic, voice gravel and grace. No species shall be erased for being hard to manage. It wasn't poetry exactly. It was better, policy that remembered blood. They memorialized the lost without turning them into excuses. Keystone's captain got a street in a city he'd never walked, and a scholarship at a school he would have hated for the noise and loved for the kids. The names filled a wall that wasn't stone or screen, but something you had to stand in front of to understand. News traveled faster than ships. On worlds that had thought the Concord eternal, people tried on the oddness of choice. A baker on an Omiri world put seeds in a loaf because nobody had told her not to. A Kron cadet asked an old sergeant why obedience had been the only lesson. The sergeant shrugged in a way that made room for a new answer. In a room with a window, Stone and Chen stood with coffee and looked at a sky that had the decency to be blue. "We didn't win," Chen said after a long quiet. "We survived. We changed the room. Winning is just a word for the day you get to breathe while you fix things," Stone said. "Tomorrow we get the bill. We'll pay it. We always do." A technician cleared his throat, apologetic and excited. "Admiral, we're picking up a pattern from extragalactic space. Not Concord, not anything we've cataloged." He hesitated. "It hurt us." Stone nodded like she had a bad knee and a good spine. "Of course it did. Thunder carries." She didn't call for panic. She called Elena. She called Krell and Thax. She called the Kurath elder and the Omiri baker if you squinted. She called the whole messy choir to rehearsal. "We just taught one empire what happens when you try to make us quiet," she said over a net that now belonged to more than humans. "Another audience might be on its way. We won't perform alone." Mojave Night returned weeks later and finally sounded like itself. Bugs, a breeze, a far truck, a person laughing 2 ridges over. Above it, a string of human hulls traced faint lines where nobody had been allowed to draw before. "We keep our noise," Americans say, which is a way of saying we keep the right to knock on our neighbor's door at midnight with pie and a question. The galaxy had tried to make us library silent. We turned the stacks into a community center. Somewhere far beyond the rim, censors older than anybody's pride woke and said each other's names. They would come to see who had bent a planet killer with math and will. When they arrived, they would not find a species practicing to die well. They would find a crowd of survivors holding hands across lanes of light, ready to argue, build, and, if pushed, sing until the rafters shook. The thunder hadn't ended. It had learned harmony.